So I'd like to introduce Professor Luke Marsh. He is a personal chair of post-Soviet and comparative politics and deputy director of the Princess Dashkova Russian Centre at Edinburgh University. He is an expert in the politics of the former Soviet Union, especially Russian and Moldovan politics, political parties in the FSU, democratization, and institution building. He's also an expert in Russian nationalism, Russian foreign policy discourse, and the radical left in Europe. Thank you so much for joining me on the podcast. And a quick little advert before we get into it. Welcome to Silicon Valley Podcast. If you enjoy the material we create, then please like and subscribe to help boost the popularity of our videos in YouTube. Well, thank you so much, Luke. Let's get straight into it. But before we launch into the questions, could you please introduce yourself and say a little bit about your area of expertise and why your understanding of Russian history and political culture can help explain the events unfolding today?
Yeah, well, thanks a lot. But my job title is a bit of a mouthful, but it does show that my background kind of crosses European politics and party politics, although kind of my PhD was in Russian and East European studies. So I've always tried to have quite a deep understanding of Russia, but I've tried to put it in comparative perspective. I've historical perspective as well. My focus on kind of the left and populism and nationalism is themes that kind of cross European politics and relate to Russia's influence outside the country as well. I was originally educated at Greece and Birmingham, where I was taught Russian. It doesn't really exist anymore, which is another story, but it kind of got me as a network of a kind of generation of Russian scholars in the UK and Europe. So it was kind of good background.
And I mean, my first question is a little bit of perhaps a self-serving one, but how is the war affecting academic life? Have the sanctions had any impact on the work that you do, your colleagues, and the work of the university?
Yeah, the university has fairly proactively, after obviously a kind of pause where people were very shocked by this, opened up a kind of scholarly channels to Ukraine in particular. And we've now got a partnership with Taras Shevchenko University in Kiev. Edinburgh had a twinning partnership with Kiev that wasn't very publicly advertised. We had lots of those. So that's one of the things. We have divested ourselves of any contacts with official Russian organizations. I mean, we didn't have many anyway, particularly now that Erasmus doesn't really exist, but the Dashkova Centre in particular used to be part of the kind of partner organization of Ruski Mir. For various reasons, we got rid of that a few years ago, but the former head of Ruski Mir, a guy called Vyacheslav Nikonov, who's actually an MP for United Russia these days, and he's not one of the most hawkish pro-war MPs, but that's not saying much. He's still a supporter of the war. He had an honorary doctorate, and that's been revoked as well. More broadly, I think it's encouraged interest in all things Ukrainian. It leaves those of us who, I think that should have some long-term, hopefully have some long-term outputs in terms of actually increasing the interest in Ukraine as a subject in its own right. I mean, previously in the university, every time I tried to persuade those upstairs to kind of invest in countries beyond Russia or suggest to them that I wasn't necessarily the best equipped to supervise on things like Bulgaria and Ukraine and things like that. They're different countries. I kind of got a sense of, well, the East is the East, it's all kind of one, and it's seen through the kind of Moscow viewpoint, and hopefully that's changing. And for those of us who study Russia, I think it's a difficult time. I've got a grant with some colleagues in London that's just been turned down on the basis of it being impractical. They liked it, but we were proposing to talk to, have Russian partners, maybe have some Russian research fellows, those kind of things. It's not realistic in the current time frame. Don't know when it will be, but I mean, getting there is an issue. Visas would be an issue. Getting people to talk to you would be an issue. But personally, it's difficult as well, because it is a country which you've invested in a lot. You try to have a nuanced view to it. you're aware of the need to distinguish the political regime from Russians generally, but a fairly brutal and horrible war, which is, you know, I mean, we don't know the details of the support base, but, you know, it's Russia's war as well as Putin's war. It's very problematic. I'm not teaching it at the moment. I think I'd have had, when I teach it again, I think I'm going to need to make some changes in terms of making it much more bottom up, kind of decolonize it. I mean, these are themes that we have in higher education at the moment generally, but they can be kind of cliches, but we're going to have to look at Russia much more as a colonizing power, a former and current empire. Those themes have been there, but I think they'll need to come to the fore. But there's also kind of big sense of kind of worry for kind of colleagues and friends in Ukraine especially, but also former contacts in Russia, many of whom have left the country. And it's by far the least important issue, but the sense of you know, how we're going to study it and understand it in future years as well. It's a kind of, again, minor on the scale of things. It's a kind of personal loss as well. We kind of lost a country we studied and loved parts of, has kind of taken a very dark path.
There's a certain taint that will take maybe generations to go. I guess it's a little bit like, you know, if you were studying, you know, German literature in the 1950s or 40s, I mean, you might have felt a similar, loss of, let's say, joy and innocence in studying the subject.
Yeah, and we've made, you know, we have an international student body, and you know, I used to teach Russia very much from a kind of liberal democratic kind of pro-democratization agenda, not gender as such, but that was the literature. I mean, and you're at pains, particularly given the kind of basis of students from non-Western countries, to kind of look at different viewpoints and not kind of beat the democracy brush too hard. But I mean, there are things that within the current conflict, with a few nuances, there's a right and a wrong. There's an aggressor and there's an invader and an invaded, those kind of things. And that is going to be, that's going to have to feed back into the way we study it. Again, while being careful not to tar all Russians with the same brush, but be very much aware that there are some very unpalatable things that are being done in the name of Russia. And we can't shy away from them in the name of kind of objectivity and balance, really.
And I find it fascinating, a phrase you just mentioned there, which is decolonisation. And from what I read, it's been interesting that the media, academia, and several fields for decades now have almost followed the Russian sphere of influence agenda by treating, you know, countries in the former sphere of influence as sort of secondary, or not necessarily even really studying those, you know, their literature and language as independent entities. I guess that now has to change. But why do you think, you know, academia especially has not treated Russia as a colonial expansionist power, which for someone like me, I may be a little extreme in this, but you know, Muscovy has been an expansionist, aggressive power since the 14th century. I mean, there's plenty of evidence for this over the centuries.
Very interesting, and I guess there are lots of strands to that kind of argument as well. I think linked with what I said earlier, the kind of democratization agenda, it's kind of what I grew up with in the kind of my kind of academic journey started with that in the 1990s. It was very much the kind of the dominant paradigm. So people who studied Russia kind of came at it from a sense of it was democratizing. You know, there were steps back. It was a kind of trajectory. They did that, or they didn't consider it important at all. I distinctly remember some colleagues when I was a PhD student. Some colleagues were trying to engage the House of Commons and the UK government at the time, this was around about 97, 98, in the need to invest more in the study of Russian language in particular. And they got told there was no market basis for it. So I think you're coming to a sense where you're either seeing Russia as a kind of bit of a basket case and not really that important, or it's kind of becoming convergent with the West. And therefore you don't need to deal with some of the knotty issues of history and language. And you know, the language is all important because you can only really get a sense of some of the kind of almost psychotic discourse that's going on that makes Putin look even moderate. You know, some of the stuff is clipped on YouTube, on TV, but you delve deep into the kind of thoughts of Dugin and others, and you know, you get a real sense of the depth of the divergence of worldview, and you can only do that with language. And so that's one thing. You know, Russia wasn't taken seriously as a colonial power; it was seen as a converging power. Yeah, and I think it's a kind of legacy. Alongside that, there was a legacy in political science of, again, countries don't really matter. You know, why study France? You study the EU, you study convergence, those kind of things. And I think alongside the other thing going on, that then, you know, why study Poland separate? Why study Ukraine separate? And I felt that very strongly within my own department. As I said, that, you know, you've got one Russian person, they can do all of these. So you're again looking at it from the Moscow-centric viewpoint as well. And the lack of integration between things like political science, history, language, those kind of things, again, were a product of the academic changes post-Cold War as well. Yeah, there's a lot more to it than that, I think. But those are my personal experiences.
And do you think that also ties into, I mean, fundamentally, analysts both in Russia and the West have got the sequence of events totally wrong. There were a few voices who were saying, no, Putin's going to invade. And there were even fewer voices saying it's going to be all-out war, and it's going to be brutal, and he's going to use Second World War tactics. And you know, there were a few, maybe like Timothy Schneider, who were like saying, yeah, this is definitely going to happen, and this is how it's going to play out. Probably because of his, you know, deep-rooted understanding of the politics of the region, not just seeing everything through a Moscow lens. But you know, do you think to an extent the propaganda narratives coming from Russia, they really do play on nationality, on a sense of national identity? And to an extent, we've ignored those. We thought those were unimportant. And yet propaganda has really got its claws into the way a lot of people think and feel, and influence them over, you know, these slightly more detached narratives.
Yeah, there's multiple ways in which that occurs. I think Russia's also very good at using our narratives in its own service. So although it's not particularly my background, I'm more comparative politics than IR, there is a tradition in IR that you may be familiar with, realism, that kind of assumes that states operate according to balance of power, rational interests, spheres of influence, which is very important as far as Ukraine goes. So that's, you know, the Russian elite talks in those terms, and there's one dominant strand that has been in their kind of lexical arsenal for a while, you know, NATO enlargement, these kind of things. And, you know, if that ties into, again, an academic tradition in the West that feeds into the idea that Russia is, you know, it has its own sphere, should be left alone. And if there are these cultural, linguistic, national differences, then, you know, they all operate within this kind of post-Soviet sphere, and there aren't, you know, these countries are defined by being post-Soviet and the communist experience, rather than there being aspirations, again, to decolonize. And again, it totally diminishes it's a kind of imperial, it's its own imperialistic viewpoint. So it sees the only kind of the key global points as the kind of imperial capitals, you know, Washington, Moscow, and doesn't really see the periphery. And that is kind of perversely quite popular on the right and the left in the West.
It's a simplification, isn't it? It allows you to make sort of lots of broad generalizations without necessarily engaging with the detail on the ground.
Yeah, well, it's popular for those reasons. In the same way, the kind of democratization paradigm allows you to kind of make extrapolations from universal laws about how things democratize without really knowing the culture of the region. So all of these things the linkage is not really understanding the internal politics and history and language of respective regions and how they differ. And again, a kind of homogenization. I mean, the critical mistake I think we've made is assuming that Ukrainians and Russians are much more alike in their history, and kind of buying into, the Muscovite narrative is that the 1,000 years of history that emerged in Rus, and it's only when you really delve into the Ukrainian narrative you see how contested that is, and even if it assumes much more kind of similarities than are actually perceived.
It really is the case of the victor telling the story, isn't it?
Yeah.
Because even now you speak to many Russians and they'll tell you that their country is incapable of democracy. Don't impose your system on us because it won't work in Russia. I mean, there are a few opposition voices like Ilya Yashin and others who speak in a language which is 100% familiar to us, but there are not that many of them. However, that narrative that democracy won't work in Russia, I imagine that really had its roots in the communist regime. They'd love people to think that. Putin would love the Russian population to believe that democracy is not suitable for their country. I happen to believe that it could definitely evolve democracy. Russia's no less capable of adopting that system than any other countries that made that transition. I don't know what your thoughts are there.
Yeah, I think it's an immensely self-serving argument that uses a particular version of history and Russian uniqueness that you said kind of comes from the Soviet period, but also ties into kind of these longer ideas of Moscow as the third Rome, those kind of things, exceptionalism, and the Slavophile argument vis-a-vis the Westernizers. And it also relies very much on the experience of the 1990s as saying that democracy doesn't work. And actually, when you break that down, it's quite clear that the parallel reform of the economy with the introduction of democracy was probably disaster waiting to happen. If you impoverish and disorientate people at the same time as you're trying to introduce a new and supposedly better system, then that's, if in a way it's amazing it took till 1998 for democracy to become fully a kind of swear word within Russia, and Putin's exploited that from the word go. I think that there's nothing culturally, there's nothing kind of biologically that means that Russians can't be democratic. And I think paradoxically that's one of the reasons why the Ukrainian issue is kind of so neuralgic for the Kremlin, because they're not, despite what we said, there are many differences, but there are lots of similarities. Common language, shared common history, and yet Ukraine has been an imperfect democracy, but they've made a lot more strides along that in terms of getting rid of presidential power, uprising against corrupt governments, those kind of things, to show that actually and Putin seems to refer to this when he talks about Ukraine as a kind of anti-Russia. It's this alternate on the doorstep, part of the supposed sphere of influence. It's this alternate pathway that's I mean, the end point of that would be, and maybe we'll get there, hopefully, is Ukraine as a kind of fully respectable EU state, which has linguistic and cultural differences for sure, but is a democracy. And that is a kind of an affront to Putin. And, I think to start with, he was kind of agnostic about democracy. It might work, it might not, but it's clear that it affects state interests and personal interests. So the Kremlin long kind of tolerated all kinds of divergent ideological groups, but the kind of the red line was if they started critiquing the state power. And democracy involves a devolution of state power and a transparency that the Kremlin doesn't like about its financial shenanigans and those kind of things. So it's a kind of existential issue that doesn't come from it builds on these, I think these instincts from the Soviet era as well of democracy as being a kind of antithesis, but it's linked with more personal, self-serving sense of what it takes to preserve the Kremlin's power, and democracy would remove it.
And isn't it very telling that up until 2012, actually the Russian economy was doing pretty well, but that's because they had quite a few liberal advisors, and the sort of imperialist agenda wasn't dominating the business of government. But at the same time, one of the first things that Putin did was take over the TV channels, was to ban or stop the broadcasting of satirical programs. So you had a system of relatively liberal economics, relatively rational economics, combined with already the, I would say, the framework for the sort of tyranny that's now very rapidly engulfing the country.
Yeah, I think that, again, in terms of rethinking how we deal with Russia, a lot of the seeds for what happens now are there a long time ago, even on the accession of Putin to power. I mean, the Chechen example is one that's kind of lays very heavy on my mind in terms of we don't know the death toll there. You know, it's upwards of 100,000, and most of these are citizens, and a lot of those citizens are ethnic Russians, and that's not to say that ethnic Russians are superior in any way to Chechens, but it's just the idea that Russia is absolutely indifferent to the death of people it claims to protect and and is brutal. And, it's the expediency of this. Again, that comes from Stalinism and Leninism as well. But, state expediency trumps lives. And that's kind of what we're seeing here as well. And I think there's something else that you alluded to there that is really, really important as well. The kind of the imperialism, the ideology, the kind of sense in which the state is driven by an ideology rather than rationality, those elements were there. And as someone who studies Russian nationalism, they were clearly important, but they've moved gradually from margins to mainstream. But even before this, even in 2014, when Putin took Crimea, those arguments were kind of mobilized and justified for a little bit, and then they were dropped. And then there was all of the rabid nationalists were talking about Novorossiya and the need to kind of go in beyond the Donbass and those kind of things. And Putin toyed with them and then dropped them. But this time he's kind of gone all in. So that, again, the sense of the picking and choosing from democratic rhetoric and this kind of statist realism that made people think these are kind of rational actor focused on economic growth and kind of stability, and is kind of risk averse as well. All of those things kind of go out the window. That doesn't mean there hasn't been some personal development of Putin himself. It's not like I think, and I don't think we should assume that our current conjuncture is necessarily inevitable. And the reason I'd say that is because, obviously, although they've kind of jumped in behind what Putin's doing with kind of absolutely kind of frothing rage, this decision was, we misread what Russia was going to do, but a lot of the Russian policymakers didn't think that going into Ukraine was necessarily the most obvious thing.
And they would, even those that thought he was going to do something, thought it would be a limited operation to extend their activities in the Donbass, or to put that official kind of stamp on them and formally invade that area. I remember seeing, there are a number of people I watch quite a lot who usually get these things absolutely right. And usually their minds go to the worst possible scenario and they're correct. Bloggers like Ilya Varlamov, and then you've got, looking up here, Viktor Shenderovich, who of course introduced the satirical program that Putin banned early on, which was the Russian version of Spitting Image. Normally these guys absolutely understand what's sort of going on and predict it with uncanny accuracy. All of them in this instance did not think a full-scale war was going to go ahead, and to an extent was sort of wrong-footed. And I believe a lot of military analysts the same sort of thing, because it just seems to be quite an irrational move. If you look at Putin, as you say, as a rational actor, as someone who's just sort of looking for opportunities, his actions now seem to be far more ideologically driven rather than fact-based. Do you think that's fair? Yeah,
I think so, absolutely. And you started by talking about the perception of a kind of limited operation in the Donbass. And interestingly enough, in his victory speech just now, that was the only thing he concretized, really. Everything else beyond that is a little bit nebulous. I mean, there's kind of grand schemes about fighting fascism and things. And I think a lot of people thought that if he limited himself to that, militarily, it wasn't a big ask. To just extend okay, Ukraine's best armies are there, but if you concentrated on doing that and doing it well, you'd have he'd have probably achieved it before the West could have got their act together, or the Ukrainian, and pushed the Ukrainian forces out before a counterattack. And funnily enough, that may be what he ends up with. Yes, there's a land bridge and those kind of things, and for him strategically, the link to Crimea is important, but he hasn't got that much more. You know, so again, why try and go all in? And despite what they say now, as you know, there was most people think that there was an attempt to kind of take Kiev in about 3 days, and an assumption that everything's going to be relatively smooth and they'd be welcomed with open arms. I mean, the ideological shift is there again, because it's these things again have been brewing around in the Kremlin's ideological arsenal for years. So it's not like a lot of these things, the ideas that are being formulated, are entirely new. And if you trace it back, there are statements of Kremlin figures the last 20, 30 years saying that they didn't think Ukraine was really viable and it was part of their sphere of influence. But Putin has developed this into some kind of very distorted version of his own history through the tract that he wrote in 2021 and his kind of extensive speech just before he invaded, in terms of all of this kind of misreading of history and saying that Ukraine is a kind of creation of Lenin and it's artificial, and the emphasis on the brotherhood and the fact that there are no national distinctions acknowledged at all, except that there's some kind of distortion of Nazism and the West, these kind of things. So he is articulating some of the ideas that again were seen as absolutely, these were utterly fringe in the 1990s, were kind of being used to kind of pump up the adrenaline of the public discourse throughout the 2000s, and occasionally floated in public sphere in the early 2010s, but now they're mainstream. And I think we're focusing on that is going to be how that has happened. There are people around Putin who are very hawkish, and it fits very much into the Silovik mindset. You know, it gives it a kind of patina of intellectual justification. Whereas I think if you see them as people who are kind of cold warriors, who are kind of functionally, psychologically paranoid, anti-Western, concerned with their own power, not losing global status, and worried about the end game for Putin now that he's at least in his last third. He may not last that long, but no, it builds on that. It reinforces their power and draws on. But it's been it's been incremental, and then so much so that we didn't see it, and then it's kind of gone full-bloodedly nationalist in a way that, you know, I argued it wasn't a few years ago. So
yeah. You know. And some of those people will be will see through that, but I guess some of them within the you know, the Siloviki class, the power structures and security services, I mean, some of them will genuinely believe they're not fighting Ukraine, that Ukraine's just a pawn or a proxy for their eternal war with America. And I think what hurts Putin the most is that for the last few years, Russia's been an irrelevance to America. It just doesn't even figure in their thinking until Russia becomes a problem, you know, like an angry hornet, you know, you have to bat it away. That must hurt, not being feared more than anything else.
Yeah, and it's a kind of psychological, it's the psychology of the Siloviki and Putin, as well as their reading of history. It's, you know, better to be feared than ignored, I think. And interestingly enough, there were lots of coverage of the way that Joe Biden was dealing with Putin to start with, by, you know, a year or so ago, saying that, well, at least he's giving him the time of day, he's talking to him, there's divergence of views, this is kind of what is needed. It might go some of the way towards the sense of inflating the sense of self-importance and that Russia needs to be engaged with, but it clearly wasn't enough. And one wonders where the end point of this would be. You can go down quite a scary train of thought if you take that to the extreme, is that, you know, how will Russia deal with losing?
I think Macron didn't get the memo, did he? Because that policy has ceased to work, but Macron is still beating that drum there, trying to appease, trying to create a sort of off-ramp or some face-saving initiative. shouldn't we now face the facts that something that Russian oppositionists have been saying for a while and were derided, that Putin is basically a terrorist. He's holding the world to hostage. He's holding the world's food reserves to hostage by blocking Ukrainian ports, and his actions show a total contempt for life, not just on the Ukrainian side, civilian and military, but a total contempt for his own people, for his own troops.
Yeah, I think, and again, this feeds back into my sense of how do I teach this? Because I used to teach it with nuance, and you were aware of these kind of what appear to be simplistic arguments about mafia states, authoritarianism, totalitarianism, but all of the kind of niceties have fallen away. He's very much motivated by the might is right. There are totalitarian elements in the way that Russia is developing, in terms of the maximum control and the ideologization, those kind of things, and he rules by this forced manufactured consent, and increasingly just kind of topped down by fear and brutality. And you said contempt for life, those kind of things, kind of rogue leader. And Macron, I'm ambiguous about. Someone's got to talk to him. I don't think it'll have any practical effect from our point of view, but just to kind of tap his mindset and see where he is. I think we probably know the answer to that. But again, in terms of if there's a sense in which he feels that no one is talking to him, that could be quite dangerous. But we may be going there anyway. I think, again, this is about empire and status, and it's not about sphere of influence, off-ramps, all of those kind of things. I think it's become very clear to me that what, the off-ramp, lots of people are calling for ceasefires. Lots of people on the left who I study call for ceasefire. Yeah, we're all against bloodshed. Standing up to Putin involves a lot of bloodshed. But if you have a ceasefire with him, what happens? These revanchist, imperialist ideas are not going to go away. Any territory he's taken from Ukraine will be a kind of police state. There will be, we know this from the Donbass already, there's deportations of anyone who's sensitive, a kind of occupation regime. And it's genocidal. I mean, if we're going to use those kind of things, it's a high bar to reach kind of legally. And again, this was a debate when Yushchenko talked about the Holodomor in 2004, is that not too politicized? These kind of things. And a lot of Russian people coming from the Russian side was, Stalinism affected all nationalities, those kind of things. So, but again, the Ukrainians know what Russia is about, and Putin has shown that kind of face. It is, the abuses that we see in Bucha and other places are systemic. They're systemic to a system which doesn't take care of human life, doesn't train its soldiers, brutalizes its soldiers, doesn't have any sense particularly of women's rights, domestic violence, all of those kind of things, and works on the basis of terror. And these are a lot of the tactics. Why are they bombing civilian infrastructure? Yes, it makes sense for them economically to weaken Ukraine and make it dependent, but it's also a terrorist tactic. Yeah. So I think the worst words can be used to Putin now.
Yeah, I think the veil's drawn away, and in a way we've all gone a bit Luke Harding and John Sweeney, who were the outliers before. Yeah, Edward Lucas, New Cold War. I mean, again, I remember he was thinking, 2008, is this not a little bit extreme? Yeah,
I don't think we need to. I think looking back on it, we're going to need to wonder about the inevitability of this or not. And I wouldn't say it was inevitable. Again, it's with the rise of Stalin and all of those kind of things. There are going to be some junctures where things might have been different. And again, had it been a different leader than Putin, I don't think despite all of the thing that the Russian political class share, I don't think you necessarily have the same decision. So it's going to be to try and unpick that. But again, like Stalinism having the seeds in Leninism and Marxism, I think, as we said, the brutality of Putinism was there from the start. It might have been moderated to some degree. And again, I think the brutality of Putinism comes from domestic circumstances about power retention and perceived status in the world. some degree, we've looked, the West is kind of nipping around the edges, and short of a kind of much more containment policies earlier. There's a lot of things where it was very difficult to kind of have traction on Putin at an earlier stage. What we definitely didn't need to do was accept Putin's money and the kind of corruption of our political systems through the kind of export of their capitalism. And once UKOS was expropriated, that was, again, I was reading Catherine Belton's Putin's People, which again is excellently written, but it does have this core narrative all the way through that Putin is a terrorist,
Yes.
And to the degree that he's funding the Red Army faction allegedly in the in the 1980s. So there's that theme all the way through.
Yeah, and far right groups, over the last 10 years or so, a lot of the illiberal movements, that have been gaining traction, and a lot of the propaganda lines. I mean, again, I'm not a conspiracy theorist, but I wouldn't be surprised if you can't trace a lot of the funding and a lot of the strategy and a lot of the messaging back to, GRU or Olgina or these other centers, these lie factories, which have been created to exert hard power, I would say.
Yeah, and they have traction as well, because take it at the most basic, the idea that that Ukraine has a kind of Nazi problem, and it was a kind of neo-Nazi coup. That's shared by a lot of people who don't really have much of an understanding of what's going on. And Ukraine has a far-right problem, but then so does France and many countries. And ultimately, I think it's again a deflection, because if you're looking at the fundamental of what is far-right politics in terms of strong nationalism, authoritarianism, denigration of other nations, kind of ultimately expansionism, then the epicenter of that is Russia. And this is again one of the biggest paradoxes that and going back to the idea of about using non-nuanced terms, and the anti-fascist power is becoming much more fascist. So absolutely, there's lots of elements of fascism within the Russian state. And it's utterly bizarre and terrifying.
Absolutely. And I was talking to Ian Garner about that, and something I wasn't aware of, but a sort of Soviet-style list of approved literature has been introduced to Russian schools. Mm-hmm. And, anything that could be thought of as oppositional, as perhaps glorifying another point of view, even, Master and Margarita and novels like that, We by Zamyatin, anything that could be seen to encourage people to think or challenge authority has been taken off the official government reading list. And Ian said something that really hit me that I hadn't really thought of, because, like you, having lived in Russia in the 90s, and all my friends and acquaintances have grown up in that period, many obviously left the country, but you tend to assume that the younger generation is going to be more liberal than their parents or grandparents. But Ian made the point that with the incredible indoctrination going on in schools, you might see, a generation now who are in sort of primary school actually being far less liberal and open-minded than their parents.
Yeah, and I think those are developments that really need to be focused on, and probably haven't been focused on enough in the discussion to date. I mean, there has been research on patriotic education and those kind of things, so people have been aware it's going on. There was always a much more pluralist environment, in as much as those attempts quite often founded on the basis of different regional policies and things, and the attempt to kind of in the late 2000s to come up with the correct version of history and those kind of things. A lot of focus was on that, but the actual implementation was very patchy. And I think we also tend to look on Russian propaganda as very clumsy and contentless, and like the Z, I mean, it means nothing. It's an empty symbol. And yes, it's sporadically adopted in some places, but others have taken on it. You've gone absolutely gung ho. But I think you're right. It's this environment of indoctrination, again linking back to the sense of Russia as kind of becoming totalitarian. It's even kind of it's this sense of threat, and it can be changed. It's the sense of Russia as always under attack, the besieged fortress, those kind of things. And when you're there, even a long time ago, you could see that these messages are being pummeled through the media, and they're switched according to different audiences. I remember seeing a discussion of the Chechen war, and there was an explosion in Dagestan, and one of the this was very minor, but it was a sense of the kind of things that don't reach our attention, and it was being blamed on Dutch engineers who are a conduit for international terrorism. I think the troubling thing where this education and this indoctrination buys into, which is becoming ever more obvious right now, is there's a kind of total blame shifting. There's a sense of Russia as I study Russian politics, but there kind of isn't any. There's no sense in the media of any real substantive criticism of what goes on in Russia. The political parties for a long time, they talk in vague generalities about parties of thieves and swindlers. They never attack Putin, those kind of things. But this has kind of deeper roots. And again, I think the roots of this are tied ultimately to Stalin and antecedents there. Stalinism was never fully debunked, as we know. Khrushchev had the cult of personality, but that's the thing. It's an individualization of a systemic issue, which is to do with the fact that power is seen, and vlast is seen as this thing that is good. At the best, it's kind of missionary, but it can't be critiqued. And then obviously Gorbachev started to do this. And Yeltsin, in the early kind of 1990s, started deconstructing, kind of opening up archives and talking about Katyn and things like that. But then the economic crisis took over and Putin came in and closed the lid. So there's never been an honest discussion about imperialism or crimes. They started that and then the state collapsed. And we know from our own countries how difficult it is to talk about the past without it being politicized, debates over statues, those kind of things. But there's a much bigger role there. And if you're building a new generation of people who don't question it and take on this sense of the problems always coming from outside, then you've got a fertile kind of ground on which to build any kind of conspiracy theories. Very, very worrying.
And this it's also a problem, isn't it, of interpretation of Western politics and media, in that we see the 90s and even Putin to an extent as being a break from the past. And okay, all these problems are coming back again, but it's, to an extent, it's almost positioned as sort of, new problems, or it's an individual like Putin. Isn't there a systemic issue here, which is essentially, and this is going to sound quite hawkish, but essentially the terrorist Gruppirovka or group who took over the country in 1917 and expanded the police state, which had already been in place for, I don't know, 10, 20, 30 years after the assassination of, see, this is where I get very dodgy with my history, but essentially the police state started in the late 19th century and then was massively expanded by the Bolsheviks. To an extent, isn't the rise of Putin a continuation of that police state, of a class of security services controlling every aspect of society, rather than the problem of an individual? Yeah,
I think you're right on that, and it's not. Although Putin might not, a different leader than Putin might have taken a different decision vis-a-vis the mechanics of when to invade, whether to invade. The general ruling clique share a worldview. Mm-hmm. It's not that there aren't others who dispute it, and what is clear to some degree is those people do exist, but they're silenced or pushed out. So it's not a genetic or historically preconditioned future for Russia, but these people are very good at keeping power, eliminating challenges to their power, and consolidating and augmenting it. So it's the extension of that police state. Again, it was partially broken up under Yeltsin, so there's discontinuities. But Putin, again, revising some of my earlier sentiments on this, he is very much a Stalinist. What is missing is the ideological basis, is that they've dispensed almost completely, except on symbolic occasions, which are designed to kind of pacify the left part of the electorate. They dispensed with the ideological underpinnings of Marxism, Leninism, all of those kind of the kind of economic challenge to the West. Putin has talked repeatedly about how he doesn't like communism. It was inefficient, those kind of things. It was an ideological cockroach, as I think he once described it. So you kind of couldn't kill it, but it, you know, was just a kind of pest. But also they thought it inefficient, but it stopped them getting rich. Yeah. you know, they've got wealth beyond their wildest imaginations. But to all other intents and purposes, the mechanics of Stalinism, with the kind of late Stalinist ideology, the post Great Patriotic War, which is the crux of this, with the kind of the mix of the church and nationalism and the myth of victory, all of those are the underpinnings of the regime. And with Stalinism as the core, everything else is possible as well. The kind of brutality, you know, it doesn't have to be mass purges, but we can see where those come from.
And in terms of myths and propaganda and the mechanisms of control, they kind of inherited those from the Soviet period and improved upon them and actually exported them. I mean, what struck me under Trump, and very controversial here, dare I say Brexit, is that, you know, some of the techniques, tactics that have been upgraded for the digital age were clearly being exported, or at least the learnings were coming from, you know, the total control of people's worldview that the Soviets kind of managed to achieve. But it was made more efficient and perhaps tapped more into, as you say, people's individual concerns like, you know, poverty and being disenfranchised and nationalism. Yeah, and they kind of perfected these techniques in domestically. When elections were contested, they had these, again, as you probably know, this this kind of political technology as one of the most kind of vibrant sectors of the economy in the early 2000s, you know, and practiced basically the art of manipulation of their domestic opponents via, you know, again, it was tried in the Yeltsin era, but wasn't very efficient, but they perfected it to the degree that they controlled their own elections, and then they started exporting it. And again, if we want to revisit books, you know, Andrew Wilson's Virtual Politics of 2005, you know, it seemed to lose a little bit of, you know, it seemed to be very much of its time, but it's worth revisiting as a sense in which, you know, he talks very much about this as being a repurposing of the KGB's active measures and their sense of the use of force, persuasion, kind of media propaganda, indoctrination, all of those kind of things. And like I said, they did it domestically. They tried to do it in Ukraine in 2004, and it didn't work because Ukraine didn't act like a Russian province. Again, there was some obvious problems that were already evident there. But then they have started exporting that in the world of social media and exporting it as models which they can kind of try and influence public opinion in other Western countries. Again, sometimes effectively, sometimes not, but they certainly post-financial crisis, there's been a willing audience. And they presented themselves, again, I'm looking at RT, Russia Today, which, consistent with what I was saying before, is much more about America or the West today than it is anything to do with getting any sense of what's really going on in Russia. But I mean, it's crude and it's not particularly sophisticated, but it does at least present this idea of Russia as this kind of insurgent anti-imperialist power, which again is buying into this sense of it's taken such a long time for people who maybe have justified criticisms of Western policy post-Iraq, that kind of thing, the way things work in Western capitalism. Russia's presented itself as an alternative to this, but it's prevented people seeing what is actually driving Russia as a political actor, and all of these kind of brutal machinations behind the scenes as well. Limited effectiveness generally, I think, but enough to kind of affect the debate and enough to affect certain weak points in our society. So, for instance, Brexit, you know, I think that comes from domestic reasons.
our long Euroscepticism, mistakes within the Conservative Party, those kind of things. But very adept at playing on Western weakness there and UK weakness.
Throwing petrol on the fire, I think.
Exactly, that's the
and I know you're busy, but I've got one last question, really, that hopefully will sort of wrap this up and turn the focus back to Ukraine. As you say, some of the propagandist tropes are still working in places like Bulgaria, India, China are still regurgitating a lot of the Kremlin's talking points, but they're not working in Ukraine. They're not even working in those Russian-speaking areas that might have been more inclined previously to be sympathetic to Russia. And now I think that's going even further, isn't it? We're seeing Soviet mythology being dropped, being ripped out of people's consciousnesses. The whole Second World War mythology of them, fighting with Russia and not as a sort of victim of colonialism. I think we're seeing a rapid de-Sovietization of the Ukrainian territory, and a lot more focus, you say, on Ukrainian culture, nationality, identity, and language. That surely is going to feed into this emerging sense of statehood and perhaps more, sophisticated, democratic, independent politics.
Yeah, I think it's instructive to compare Putin's empty, somber, rather tired address on the 9th to the couple of videos that Zelensky put out, which are articulate, compelling, very much focused on kind of the human content rather than the symbols, although there's obviously powerful symbolism of walking down empty streets of Kiev or standing in front of burnt out buildings. But it's that sense that there is an alternative identity that can, and again, he was very forthright in coming forward with an alternative mythology of the victory, and saying that basically we will have two victories and you will have none. As far as Ukraine goes, I can see all of those tendencies emerging, which are very positive. The worry has got to be, and I won't end on this point because it is very worrying, is how, if Russia is bogged down, what does Russia do, and how does Ukraine get Russia out of those territories? Forgetting about the Crimea as particularly difficult for a second, you're just talking about the territories before the 24th of February and getting access back to its ports and those kind of things. That would be stopping Russia one thing, but expelling it another. So that's one issue. But to end on a more positive note, I think the things that we see within Ukraine will be expanding to a de-Sovietization of the study of Russia and a decolonization of the study of Russia. I think it's going to be very difficult for Russia going onwards because, again, this taint that you talked about is going to linger. And we've got to make sure that doesn't, from our side, go into kind of suspicion of everything Russian. But we're going to have to revisit every kind of the symbols, our understandings of those. And you also mentioned, there are obviously parts of the world where this doesn't have purchase, and maybe it never will have purchase in China at the moment because there are obvious reasons why there are similarities in the regimes there. But if we can link this to a decolonization narrative, then maybe it will have purchase in countries like India, for example. Saying that this is a colonial power, because again, it's this perception that Russia is fighting American colonialism that has and the sense of fighting American unipolarity makes it much more attractive to many people. But if we as thinkers, citizens, start to see Russia very much as the colonizer and its history as, amongst other things, but colonization, then that's going to be very bad for the history of Putinism looking back, and it may have some effect in Russia eventually, but it will affect Russia's influence throughout the world. Let's hope.
And maybe It's both pessimistic and optimistic, but a number of commentators have also, I mean, this is especially on the Russian side, Gudkov is very vocal, a former sort of KGB officer. I mean, they're basically saying that the only resolution, the clean resolution situation, is not only the downfall of Putin, but also the clique he represents, and in fact, the total disintegration of the Russian empire as such as it is. And I think Khodorkovsky has always been against that until very recently, and now he is advocating for really the breakup of Russia and a federal system as the only way to evolve towards democracy and find peace.
Yeah, I don't think we can know the outcome, because the breakup of Russia has so many unintended effects. But I think the sentiment is interesting and durable. The idea that because Russia is only formally a federation, it's a federation only in name. But it's the decolonization of Russia internally, and it involves things like Chechnya and the kind of consignment to the dustbin of history of people like Kadyrov, who are again, the naked face of Putinism. He's nothing different. We used to maybe see him as extreme, but he is the core of it. The brutality of of rule in some of the peripheries. So it's about. I think it's one thing. I don't think there's anything that's possible without the military defeat of Russia, because Russia will just do it again. That's the lesson we've taken. It would just hold on to its territories and then rearm, rethink, do it again. 8 years, 10 years, it will do it again, and we will be in a situation west-east of polarization and rearmament. It does involve some potentially tricky moments in terms of destabilization and what Putin will do if he's cornered, which is also very scary. But the Ukraine can't exist with imperial Russia on its borders, a genocidal Russia. It can't. But there has to be that reckoning and that deconstruction of that whole worldview within Russia itself. And yes, it's not just Putin; it's the style of rule, it's the people that are there. What that means for Russia geographically, I wouldn't want to say, but it needs to become a fundamentally different regime and more genuinely democratic and less colonial.
On that forward-looking note, Luke, I know we haven't sort of solved any of these problems, but it was fantastic talking to you and hearing your expertise on the subject. And I'm incredibly grateful for you spending an hour to talk to me.
Okay, thanks very much. I really enjoyed it. Thanks a lot.
Thank you so much.